Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today to discuss a very timely topic is Roya Hakakian, a famed journalist and writer. She's a refugee from Iran, and she has written multiple books, articles, has appeared on many podcasts. The book that made her well known in this area was Journey from the Land of No, but she has written a lot since then, and everything she has written is very much worth reading. Of course, I think you can guess the topic we'll be discussing, which is the future and present of Iran in the aftermath of Operation Rising Lion, which meaning what happened between Israel and Iran, and of course, including U.S. role and involvement. However, before we get into the heart of the matter, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your perspective, to introduce you to our very diverse audience?
Okay. Hi, Irina. It's wonderful to be with you and with your listeners. As you described me, I am a writer. I have also been a reporter, and I write both in English and in Persian. Recently, I've been writing a lot more in English than in Persian. Um, I left Iran in 1984 and came to the United States in 1985, where my family and I have been living ever since. I write a great deal about issues having to do with Iran, with the women's movement, with authoritarian regimes, and on the subject of immigration as well.
So, in light of your experience, so I'd like to start by discussing a little bit the issues of identity, memory, and historical continuity before getting into more political subjects. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure whether it's possible to separate one from the other. With that in mind, in the aftermath of the recent events of Operation Rising Lion, how do you see the tension between Iran's revolutionary legacy since 1979 and the pre-Islamic cultural memory evolving with Iranian society? And has it really? To what extent is it separable at this point after decades of the Islamic Republic in place?
That's an excellent issue that you're raising, and I think it goes back really to the heart of um, the opposition that people have been showing to the regime.
Mhm.
So, had this been a secular regime, had this been a regime that had not turned Islam into its core ideology value system, then I think the reaction that Iranians have shown over the years would have taken a much different shape. But because the regime has turned the issue of religion, to be exact, Shiism, into its sense of uh, main identity, then as the population begins to have uh, uh, objections to the regime, begins to take a position of protests and demonstrations, then objecting to the Islamic identity of the regime and reverting back to whatever it was that Iranians were or had prior to the advent of Islam in Iran has become also a matter of public struggle. In other words, the more the regime tried to pull the public into the direction of religion, and the more a disenchanted public that objects to the regime at its core returned to or tried to reconnect with its non-Islamic and non Shiite identity.
So given all of that, um, how has this separation, and if it has, by the way, I'm not assuming that it has shifted, if it did, the narrative space for Iranians to reclaim their diverse identities, whether they identify themselves as Persian, as Turkic, as Jewish, Kurdish, Arab, Baha'i, Christian, that the Islamic Republic has long suppressed, or minimized, or downplayed, or played against each other.
Yeah, that's also very interesting, and I think the answer is very complex. So um, while part of the great pre-Islamic and even post-Islamic culture of Iran was about multiculturalism and excuse me, and the multi-ethnic identity of Iran, be it the diversity of religious minorities that existed in Iran or the ethnic minorities, had always been a very important characteristic of what Iran and Iranians had been able to do. Um, it, Yet, despite that, it's been difficult to, even for those who object to the regime, to be able to um, talk about the variety of ethnicities or accentuate a sense of multiculturalism, because the regime and its followers immediately begin to lash out at people who celebrate or emphasize multiculturalism as separatists. So it's become all those things that were seemingly benign and innocuous issues at the hands of an intelligence ministry that's actively trying to, in any way, shape, or form, shape public debate and undermine the position of the opposition, turns into something highly explosive and political. And as such, any discussion about Iran's or Iranians' diversity of identity and cultural heritage turns into a fodder for slander and political fight, because everyone gets accused of being separatists and wanting to divide the country.
Well, do you think these recent events have changed this, or do you think the regime is just likely to double down on its methods? And because I'm not really hearing any sorts of, actually, I'm not hearing from any organized opposition inside Iran itself, and nothing that would indicate any sort of um, freedom to voice their reactions. If anything, it's been actually more muted than during previous protest movements.
Well, for one thing, the moment the bombs started to fall, the regime began to pick up opposition leaders from even outside of the major cities.
Mhm.
The rapper, a rapper had gone on vacation to an island, and he got picked up from that island. And one of the greatest ironies of the 12 days of war in Iran was that, the security forces, all the forces that should have been out and sent out to help people, guide people through, where to go and how to take shelter, or, tend to the wounded and the people who were missing. They were all told by IRGC and by intelligence officials to do the opposite, to just go to the streets and guard and make sure that no one was coming out to organize any protests or to to stage anything in objection to the regime. So they were incredibly fearful, and because of that fear, they made sure from the first moment that the war began to dedicate all their focus to making sure that the opposition is basically silenced. And today, in the past few days, we see that activists have been picked up. They're being locked up, in the name of they're catching spies who worked for
Mhm.
Israel or so on. But a lot of people have been picked up and put in prisons in the past few days. At the moment that things kind of settled down.
So it's very important to understand for those who claim that now it's up to the people of Iran to push for regime change or to rise up and so forth. Can they, if their leaders are being imprisoned and tortured in some dungeons? I'm not sure that it's practicable at this moment, given these circumstances.
I mean, the circumstances is one thing, but I also think that in some ways, the end of the war um, signaled was a signal to the regime that you have yet another lifeline. So,
Hmm.
on day one, day two, day three, it looked like um, Israel was decapitating the leadership of the regime, and
Hmm.
it was going to do the same thing as it had done to Hezbollah in Lebanon, right?
Hmm.
In Lebanon, we saw, and in Gaza, we saw that members of Hamas and members of Hezbollah were methodically eliminated until we got to the very top of the leadership hierarchy, whether it was Sinwar in Gaza or um, or the Hezbollah leader. Israel got to both of them eventually, and therefore one could argue or one could see that even though there were still elements from both organizations left, that those organizations had basically been uh, far too weakened to try to resurrect themselves in the foreseeable future. Such a thing looked like was going to happen in Iran, but it didn't. And in a culture, in a in an ideology where everything is a divine sign from God, the fact that the regime keeps standing, the fact that Ayatollah Khamenei is still in the position of supreme leadership, and he survived and he was not assassinated, means that uh, they have even more reason to carry on to do what they've always done with far more intensity. So I think the difficulty was also in the expectation that both the regime
Hmm.
and the public had set up for how this was going to go. And then the fact that it didn't go that way signaled to the regime that it's not only it has a lifeline again, but also, God is on their side and has kept them alive to do what they've always done, but far worse. And so I think it's a terrible it was a terrible message to deliver to the regime, but also it has been a terrible position for the public to be put in, um, because the regime will take and is already taking vengeance on the Iranian nation.
Think this message was a result of cultural misunderstanding, or rather misunderstanding of the regime's ideology and how they are likely to interpret this chain of events? Or do you think the parties responsible were fully aware of how it was going to be read in Tehran and proceeded regardless out of cynical calculation of some sort?
I don't I don't think it was a cultural misunderstanding. I think whatever plan Israel had, um, and whatever plan America later had, was not quite coordinated. In other words, it was very reasonable to expect for Israel to do in Iran exactly as it had done in Lebanon and in Gaza, and and the fact that it stopped short
Mhm.
um, was probably a political decision, whether it was
Mhm.
a political decision coordinated between Washington and Jerusalem, or only one impose it on the other. I'm not sure, but that decision to stop short of decapitating the Iranian leadership, and I'm not talking about replacing the regime. I'm talking
Mhm.
paving the way, making it possible for any change to take place in Iran. Once you leave that singular leader in place, you're basically saying, we got rid of, a few missiles or a couple of hundred missiles. Uh, we, we attacked the nuclear sites, even though we don't know whether they have really been set back by a few months or they have become inoperable, remains to be seen. But that final step that needed to be taken in order to make possible for real political change to come about in Iran didn't happen. And that, I don't know who made that decision. But I think that was a grave error, and for which all parties are going to suffer. Iranians are suffering already because the regime is far more uh, uh, intense in its persecution of the opposition. Israel is going to suffer because the regime remaining in place without admitting, not only it's not admitting defeat, it's in fact declaring victory, which means that they will definitely return to whatever it was that they were doing before,
Mhm.
ideologically, militarily, and all. And in a few months or a few years, we will be back where we were in 2025 when this attack became necessary. So in some ways, Israel should have followed the exact script as it had done, um,
Mhm.
both in Gaza and in Lebanon, which, by the way, paved the way for change, political change in Lebanon and Syria. Um, and now that it didn't, Ukraine, which is a big part of this equation, will also suffer because Russia managed to keep its chief ally in the region alive. And so, so the war between Russia and Ukraine will go on. There will be more drone deliveries to the Russian army and so on and so forth.
So, in light of that, do you think the social changes that could have taken place, a deeper civilizational redefinition with cultural identity and the sort of unified stance against these divisive forces and politicized Islam, do you think this will be curtailed because of this um, this situation, because of the conditions that were laid by this incomplete operation?
Um, so you're saying that can you run it by me again? You're saying that they will
Um, this possibility of a kind of a unified social force, a kind of a coming together of a more unified redefinition of identity among Iranians. Do you think it's going to be set back as a result of the situation?
well, there is very widespread fear
Hmm.
that's taken over, and of course, I think it's very easy to imagine you're a barehanded, peaceful protester against the regime, and you have watched for 12 days two powerful armies come to bomb the regime, to assassinate its top leadership, and it still stays intact. It still stays standing. So then, if you're a peaceful activist, you think to yourself, these forces, with their with their attacks, with their powerful militaries, couldn't bring the regime down. So what is it that we, empty-handed, can possibly do to bring the regime down? So I think, it's possible that, I'm being too pessimistic. I hope this is a misreading on my part. I perhaps was hoping that there could be a Yugoslavia scenario for Iran, that there would be a bombing, and then after this bombing, in some time, a year later, some shift could take place. But I think this is very different, because Milosevic had really been abandoned and didn't have sort of this global allyship that Iran has managed to create for itself. So now the destiny of Vladimir Putin and other authoritarian regimes are somewhat tied together, and they will come to each other's rescue. And I think that's what's making the Iran situation in some ways not comparable to the Yugoslavia situation. But I think this is a terrifying moment, and understandably so. But who knows? The Washington is supposed to be having negotiations with Iran next, and maybe they will come to, they will make certain conditions to steer Iran in a different direction. We'll have to see. But right now, I see the picture as being terribly grim.
Where does it leave the Iranian opposition abroad, the diaspora communities who've been watching all of this with bated breath, I'm sure, and some of whom have been pushing for Israel to complete the job?
Right. Well, I think this has been a test for the diaspora community too, because there have been some very well-known figures within the diaspora community who have been claiming to be, the future leaders of Iran, or those who could potentially bring about a moment of transition. And obviously, they have, none of them were able to rise to the occasion as a result. So I think in some ways, while this was disappointing, it was a test that they failed as well. And so the community must recognize, and I'm sure it does, that it needs to be reconfiguring its own, future coalition building, and looking for new leadership.
I certainly hope that if there is anything positive at all in this otherwise horrifying situation, that could potentially be a wake-up call for many people, both inside and outside the community, who've put their faith into figures who've done very little to back up very, very big claims. That said, there are also serious challenges for various other related causes. What is going to happen to the women? Before all of this, we've seen an increased crackdown on top of an already bad situation. Do you think it will actually get even worse? Do you think the regime will also try to use women's situation even further to consolidate power? Can it be going in the direction of the Taliban or the Houthis in trying to erase the women from the discussion altogether?
I don't think so. Um, I think that's a level too far that would
Mhm.
probably take way too much resources for them in order to enforce. Because you have to realize that part of the reason why confronting the Iran's women was had become so difficult was because from 1979 when the regime took over until 2022 the population of Iran had more than doubled.
Mhm.
So when you have such a vast population, and when you have not just one or two or three women, or a dozen who are disobeying the rules of the regime, but you have hundreds who are walking around in various cities without their heads covered, then that requires a very organized police to constantly be turning this into its first priority. They have done so in the past, and cracking down on women has been a priority, but it's hard to keep it up, especially because the numbers grow and women who are not even political have been defying the hijab laws. Just because you don't have to be political to want to dress the way you wish. This isn't, you're not making a decision whether you want to vote Democratic or Republican or anything. You just want to put on whatever it is that you want to put on. So it's become a, a lot more difficult for them to turn this into their number one priority. And while I think the crackdown that they will uh, carry out in the aftermath of this war will be brutal, at the same time, I think uh, the focus of it won't be primarily on women. I think they have a very, very, their first priority is to figure out who are the spies among them.
Mhm.
I mean, that is definitely shaking the foundations of this system because, um, however it was that Israel managed to carry out so many assassinations in such a short time, and so well, it just means that there are uh, many ways in which the Israeli intelligence has infiltrated the regime at its highest levels. And so I think their first priority will be to figure out how that happened, to catch the spies, to punish the spies, and really reevaluate their own intelligence gathering system within the country. And I think the second priority, or a priority that's as important as the other, is to make sure that there are no capable political leaders who are out and about, outreaching to people, organizing, or anything. And it is because of that that they've been picking up, some of the most well-known figures who have been in prison already but had been released. They picked them up and locked them up again. So I think these two issues will be their top priorities for the near future.
Now, as concerned as I am about the very issues that you just described, I have an additional concern, which is that the Western world and its allies from around the world who are equally concerned about Iran's assorted threats, both to its own population and to the rest of the community, are not really using this moment even from a diplomatic standpoint, wisely. What I mean is, now that the regime has at the very least been weakened, would be a good time to make very hard demands that are enforced by political measures, such as put an end to this abusive practice against women, release political hostages, including at the very least the foreign dual nationals, or face complete isolation. No welcome of in Iranian officials in Western countries, no UN meetings, no international gatherings, no diplomacy of any kind. I don't see even a rumor of that happening. Am I misreading the situation? Am I maybe not privy to what's going on behind the scenes?
No, I see it the way you see it. I think that the international community had a perfect opportunity to really deliver a major blow to Iran. Again, uh, it was not about removing this regime. It was not about conducting an Iraqi scenario, but it was about completing a process of weakening of the regime that was left unfinished. And and with that weakening, there was a lot that could be done, including the negotiations that you are talking about. I mean, if the regime came to its knees, which at the moment it has not,
Mm-hmm.
if truly accepted that it was defeated and that it wanted to negotiate and it wanted Israel and America to stop and it was willing to make concessions. Then all those things that you're saying could have been on the table. But the problem is that the regime is declaring victory. Obviously, they themselves know, behind closed doors, that they were the ones who were defeated. But
Mm-hmm.
that's not important. The important is the public face that they're putting out, and and therefore, I think there is no it's not in the cards to press the regime to do anything differently. In fact, President Trump said today that maybe they will negotiate with Iran next week, maybe they won't, because as far as he's concerned, the nuclear threat is no longer there. So what it means is that uh, you know there was a very short-sighted goal that was set
Mm-hmm.
without a really deep understanding of what this regime is all about. And now that they assume that the goal has been accomplished, then it doesn't matter what else happens, and they don't even need to negotiate.
So I'm going to be a little bit provocative here. In 1973, Egypt claimed it won the Yom Kippur War. It
Yeah.
just outright claimed it, and actually to this day, it's not been completely debunked. Nevertheless, you know, not too long after they came to the table and concluded the Camp David Accords. So it's not out of the question that in the Muslim world you can have a country for face-saving reasons refusing to admit defeat and then nevertheless preferring a cold peace to a hot war that would completely destroy the people in the government. Iran is not, however, is not Egypt. It's definitely not Sadat. Ali Khamenei is not Sadat, and neither are people around him. So
But
I don't foresee something like that happening. However, I also don't see why anyone has to wait for Iran to admit anything to start isolating them and actually taking them holding them politically accountable. This is what I why does it has to be all or nothing? Why does it
well,
have
because
to be
they have been isolated, and the isolation only created a different um, uh, global alliance, right? It was because Iran was so isolated that Russia, Iran, China, North Korea developed such a tight alliance. And in fact, after the bombing was done, the very first thing that President Trump said was, China can go ahead and buy oil from Iran.
Mhm.
So, so obviously, President Trump is aware that China needs Iranian oil, and in kind of in an act of public diplomacy, it's he's telling China that we've got your back, and we want oil to continue to flow to you and your people. And therefore, war is done. Don't worry. We watch out for your economy. So I think I think what is no longer valid in a situation where these alliances
Mm.
have been in operation, these alliances have been so effective. Um, Isolation of Iran in and of itself is not enough. It's it's making sure that the allies are also weakened. For instance, Vladimir Putin is also simultaneously weakened, um, for separate reasons, for its attack on Ukraine and so on. Um, or else, isolating Iran by itself can't work, because Iran can rely and has been relying on its other chief authoritarian allies.
Even before this current set of circumstances, Iranian political legitimacy has been questionable at best. By questionable, I mean, in my opinion, non-existent. The regime came to power through a coup. That it was never democratic. It was never upholding any sort of civil institutions, or didn't watch out for the interest of its people in any way by anyone's definition. I think that's pretty clear. Do you think this, and now it also looked militarily weak with no air defense whatsoever, and essentially Israel was able to take full control of its air fairly quickly. Do you think, to what extent do you think this operation undermined Iran's international quote unquote legitimacy? Do you think it's reputation, quote unquote, again, I'm being sarcastic because I personally don't see it as having any legitimacy whatsoever, has been undermined by the decades of repression and everything that's become known? Or do you think that the pro-regime voices in the West and assorted others who are in the gray zone area of not being quite the defenders of the regime, but also being playing the pragmatic card, have they managed to salvage some sort of uh, a view of the regime as having some quasi legitimate entity that even legitimacy that still, even despite these new additional developments, hasn't been fully destroyed? What would it take for people to admit that the Islamic Republic of Iran has no business whatsoever being in power,
Mhm.
as opposed to trying to salvage it and finding reasons for it to continue existing?
Right. I think that those who support the regime uh, outside of the United States, I'm not talking about various European governments or world governments. I'm talking about individuals who advocate for the regime, whether they're among diaspora Iranians or otherwise. Um, they have their own private agenda, and their
Sure.
own private agenda is that an anti-imperialist power,
Hmm.
uh, anti-American, anti-Israel, should not, suffer victimhood, or should not be bombed, should not be eradicated, because it's an anti-imperialist power, right? So, there are many in the United States who see Iran, um, even as they are aware of its human rights violations and all sorts of violations, they still came to its defense when the moment came for Israel to bomb it,
Hmm.
because Israel and the regime, Israel vis-a-vis the regime was a far greater evil in their minds than the regime was in doing whatever it was domestically. So I think that those who support the regime will continue to support the regime even after seeing that it was so incompetent in facing a foreign enemy, right?
Hmm.
Um, But I think the other problem is that, the international community, I think in the Arab world, Iran's weakness, it will hopefully have a huge impact because this was a regional power that was claiming to be the leader of Muslims in the world, or at least in the region. And the fact that it proved to be so weak and incapable of even defending its own leadership from coming to harm uh,
Mhm.
really is a very humiliating moment for the regime. So I think in that way, if I were to kind of take stock of what happened, I would say that humiliation within the eyes of regional powers is probably one of the only gains of this whole enterprise.
No, I'm going to be a little bit to play devil's advocate right now. I completely see your point, but at the same, and in fact, I've been hearing some of the comments from the Arab world. But at the same time, part of the reason the Arab world renormalized with Iran to begin with, aside from U.S. pressure and financial incentives and so forth, was because they thought U.S. was not going to be a consistent and reliable ally in opposing Iran, and they felt that there is greater danger in poking the Iranians and then not finishing the job than never starting anything to begin with. And now that, as you've described, the regime was basically saved by the US and Israel, or both, yes, there's a threat that, a looming threat that they can always go and finish the job if Iran gets out of hand again. But so far, they've preserved it along with all the proxies, terrorists, and everybody who threatens those Arab countries. So don't you think that will reinforce rather than actually weaken the previous concerns by these states?
Well, you're not playing the devil's advocate because I agree, because I think America, at least under President Trump, has proven not to be a reliable ally. And therefore, if you are Iraq or Pakistan, you look to Iran and you say, well, they bomb Iran one day, but what do we know what they're going to do next week? And so we might as well either keep quiet or not wish for the status quo to change, because at least the enemy is better than the enemy you don't know. So I can see that, but I also think that there is another issue that's really key here, which is that um, Iran is in a region where uh, the entire region is undemocratic,
Hmm.
and Iran is one of the only nations, it's not if not the only nation, where for the last 46 years or so, there has been a consistent, reliable, serious um, uh, civil rights protest against the regime. You don't see that in Saudi Arabia. You see it in Turkey.
Hmm.
But Turkey is not exactly considered a Middle Eastern country. You can't see it in Iraq. There are protests in Iraq, but there is nothing with the persistence of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement that we have witnessed in Iran. So if there is a place in the region that has the chance and the practice to have a successful civil rights movement and to turn the page on authoritarianism, it's Iran. Because we've seen that, time and time again, uh, people, whether in the millions or in the hundreds of thousands or in the thousands, have taken to the streets to confront the regime. Um, and I think the regional powers uh, do not wish for a regime change in Tehran, because a regime change in Tehran would mean that Iran will become a society under rule of law, possibly on its road to democracy, and that then will be a threat to the rest of the authoritarian regimes in the region. Because, let's not forget,
To challenge that Israel is already a democratic country, and you might say, well, if that hasn't caused massive revolutions in all those states, why would Iran cause it? Especially since Iran's road there is likely to be, filled with challenges anyway.
Because Israel is not a Muslim country. So,
Mm,
Egyptians don't say, oh, Israelis are a cultural threat to us because, we compare ourselves to them. No, Israel is an anomaly in the region,
mm.
opposed to, it's an exception as opposed to the rule. The rule is, Muslims. And the rule is actually Sunni, and Iran, in some ways, is the Shiite exception. Nonetheless, it's an Islamic region, and a major change for toward democracy, toward establishing a civil society, means that the threat that they have been trying to keep under wraps within their own societies, whether it's in, Pakistan uh, or Turkey or, Saudi Arabia by, locking up the women protesters and all, the threat will become more serious.
Yes.
The idea is to make sure that the people in these countries just follow their leader, follow the ruler, and wait for the leader to decide, how much freedom and how much, rights they're going to grant to people, but not that people will come out on their own and demand it from their regimes. And I think if Iran changes and changes for the better, then everybody else has to worry about their own public holding them accountable.
You touch on something that's become controversial to discuss in the US and elsewhere, which is to say that from my conversations with all these people, the more reformist countries are not threatened by Iran's change. In fact, they secretly yearn for it, but many of them are either smaller countries or have now been marginalized as voices, even, in bigger countries, so they can't really say that out loud. They don't necessarily feel threatened because they're perfectly willing to reform and they feel confident enough that their populations uh, don't need revolutions and, Western style democracies to live a good life. However, the more authoritarian factions and that have come to the surface in the last few years and have reclaimed some of the power that they seem to have lost for a while, they are certainly probably and very likely motivated by this common authoritarian instinct that has brought together very unlikely allies from all over the world, not just Iran and Arabs, but China, Russia, and so forth.
Um, yes, I think so. You're saying that there are reformist elements within these authoritarian regimes.
Yes, yes. I mean, if you talk to the hardcore old guard Saudis, they're not going to have the same reaction as Bahrainis. Moroccan liberals and monarchists are not going to have the same reaction as, Baghdad or, the authoritarians in Lebanon. It's just not going to be the same sort of concern. In fact, Morocco, for instance, hasn't had diplomatic relations with Iran for many years now, and not so clearly they would probably want to see changes, if anything. Egypt has not renormalized with Iran, despite the fact that you would think that their commonalities would bring them together, but on the contrary, they feel threatened by Iran. And Iran was one of the countries interfering in their process. Not to say that Egypt is terribly reformist, but compared to Iran, you can. It's by far more liberal in many ways than Iran. So I
So,
don't think that.
this is an ideal scenario as it has gone down. this is
Hmm.
an ideal scenario for the region because Iran has been uh, it has not been domestically weakened. In other words, you
Hmm.
still have, the supreme leader, you still have, the same authoritarian order. But as far as its foreign influence and foreign reach and international is concerned, it's been totally defanged. So if you're in Egypt or if you're in Morocco, you're not threatened by this Iran because this Iran right now has been completely defanged. It doesn't have, it doesn't even control its own airspace.
I'm not entirely sure that that's the case, and I'm not sure that in the under the current circumstances, Morocco or Egypt will run to renormalize with Iran now
No, no,
that it
they
has
will
been
not
found.
normalize. They will, I
No,
don't think they will
would do
normalize,
they
but
prefer it to the previous status quo? Yes, but do I think that a lot of people in those countries would see Iran as better off without this current regime? I do think so because I honestly believe that a lot of the reformists in those countries, or this you know, quite at least economically liberal elements, believe that the regime, because of its ideology, will always be a threat so long as it exists in any form. And I
right.
think, and I think that is the big difference between them and a lot of the Western countries. Now, the more authoritarian elements, I think they see situation exactly as you described. But the problem is, I think people misunderstand that Middle Eastern countries are not necessarily unified in their assessment, and I think they too have their internal dialogue or struggle among different directions they want to pursue. Just because they don't have the clear voting process the way the US or Europe doesn't mean that they don't also have people who shift the landscape in one direction or the other. And right now, unfortunately, it's very much going in the other.
Right. I don't disagree. I agree that probably the reformist element or the more moderate elements in the region recognize that uh, the hardline Iranian regime remaining in power is a threat, ideological threat to their own populations. That's for sure. But they're not the ones in power in their own countries either. So.
Well,
Yeah.
so here's my question. Do you think at some point the US, Israel, or some combination of both will finish the job as they now repeatedly threaten to do if Iran returns to the nuclear program, to terrorism, and or fails to agree to negotiate? Or do you think this is going to be just an endless process of promises as we have seen many times before?
As far as I can see, uh, it for the past 20, 25 years, if not longer, the issue of just the nuclear issue of Iran, let alone Iran's terror operations and terrorist behavior, has been on the forefront of international discussion, European and
Mhm.
American, and nothing ever happened. In other words, you would go to negotiate, they went to negotiations over and over and over, and there was never a resolution to really face Iran, confront Iran once and for all. Now, the only thing that changed in
Mhm.
this landscape was October 7th. October 7th caused Israel to recognize that it needed to take care of its own security by itself, that it needed to act um, in any way, shape, or form it needed to secure you know, its own land, its own population. And because of October 7th, because of Israeli attack on Hezbollah, because Iran began to attack Israel back in April with missiles, it, it was that finally Israel was able to carry out the operations it carried out in the past 12 days. So, in my view, this was the opportunity
Mhm.
to do whatever it needed to be done. And as far as I'm concerned, to say that we will do it again is to be ignorant of how much it took
Mhm.
for the world to do just these 12 days. How much it took, meaning, a 1,200 Israelis were killed, on October 7th. Then tens of thousands of Gazans were dead, have been killed, and then there's been so much suffering on so many sides, and but yet Israel went into Lebanon and was able to, do
Mhm.
all that in order to get to this moment where Israel finally attacked Iran. So I think people throw around, President Trump or Netanyahu throw around the idea that, oh, we did it once, we'll do it again. I just, based on the history, I don't see how that can happen all that easily.
So you don't think that the all these things have actually broken that threshold and made it easier for Israel to just keep up the maintenance oversight to ensure that in the future things like that don't fall under, don't get stuffed under the carpet until it's too late. I mean, now that they've done it and nothing happened, and World War III didn't break out, and masses of civilians haven't been, massacred on the streets by Israeli missiles. Now that people know that Israel can act responsibly in this situation, leaving aside all the usual naysayers who are against any military intervention whatsoever. But you don't think it would be easier for Israel to say, look, we've been watching the situation, we've been monitoring carefully. Iran is cheating again, it's lying again. We have to do what we have to do. And now we know how to do it to make sure it doesn't happen. You don't think that's a likely scenario?
Um, I don't think so.
Hmm.
I think, Iran is not Syria, where Israel, goes next door and the country is still in turmoil and, in transition. Um, I see this as, Iran is much bigger, much bigger population, and there is still, far more support. I shouldn't say support for the regime, but opposition against attacking Iran.
Hmm.
Um, that will make it very difficult for Israel to do more. And I don't think Israel can afford to, constantly be in this state of perpetual war and uncertainty,
Bottom line is Iran still has its energy largely undisturbed. Iran still has the missiles to attack Israel when it wants to. Iran's
right?
nuclear program damage is yet to be fully assessed, so we don't really know how much damage has been done and how easy it is to start. Some analysts who've been in charge of dismantling WMD programs claim that Iran already has nukes outside the country in places like North Korea, something that I've personally suspected for a very long time anyway, even before that came to this point, which could explain the regime's intransigence and refusal to make even a symbolic deal under these circumstances. So how are we really better off after all is said is done? Can it be described as anything more than political theater or a slap on the wrist?
No, no, this was a lot more than a than slap on the wrist, and it was a lot more than political theater because it
Hmm.
was it was the show we have been expecting to see but never came. So
Hmm.
it was um, it was a huge moment that it happened, and the regime is shaken up. It's lost uh, major leadership, and it needs to it needs to find its bearings again. I mean, the supreme leader today or yesterday gave a speech, and he was visibly a very different person.
Mm.
Speech in demeanor, in expression than he had been before. It was very clear that he couldn't even finish his sentences. So they've been terrified. They have been weakened. They've been humiliated, and this is a huge blow. But um, but but whether this will force, uh, you know, from within those who are in positions of power in Iran to bring about some change, or whether this will get them to, continue with, and even worse, press in their hardline positions, is something to be seen. I think they will domestically be far harsher than they were even before, but I think it's possible that they will acquiesce to some pressure internationally if they're in fact pressed. But I'm not even sure that the United States or Europe will take this opportunity to really press Iran to change or to amend its behaviors.
Do you think what happened would be any sort of a turning point on any level for the Iranian society, whether from a cultural standpoint, institutional standpoint, political awakening standpoint, or do you think it's just seen as yet another stage, yet another thing that happened?
No, no, no. This was the biggest blow this regime has suffered since its inception.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, Iran and Iraq were at war for 8 or 9 years. It was not the experience that the Iranian regime had for the 12 days of in the last month. No, this is a major turning point. But what decisions they make
Mm.
after this watershed moment is remains to be seen. I'd like to be proven wrong. I'd like to uh, be shown that the regime takes a lesson and decides that being so hardline, being such radicals doesn't pay, and it's not worth the punishment that they have suffered, and they change and they begin to reform themselves. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. And I don't think that's what's going to happen as long as this supreme leader is in command.
Now, from an institutional pressure point of view, if you were the Iranian military, at this point, I'd be asking some hard questions. What have you guys been prioritizing? Clearly hasn't been us. So I'm concerned that the regime may learn the wrong lesson from all of this and use this as an opportunity to re-equip and focus on building their capacity, building their military, and kind of rebalancing themselves to in order to become a stronger state. Is
Yeah,
that likely to happen?
that's what I think will happen.
Hmm.
That's what I would like to be proven wrong about. But I think that's what's coming.
So, in other words, would you say then for the Iranian people, the future right now is pretty much hopeless unless the West suddenly wakes up and decides to change course?
I don't think that I don't want to be the one who says that the future is hopeless.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think it's a complicated moment.
Hmm.
I think nobody expected for the end to look like this. Uh, it was not what looked like, or there was expectation for it to be like. So I think it's a complex moment. I'm hoping that the weakening of the regime and this uh, position of chaos within the high-ranking posts within the regime will perhaps possibly shake them up and there will be a shift within themselves. But no, I don't like to think that it's hopeless. I'd like to think that maybe this will be, will weaken the regime enough for they themselves to realize that in order to continue, they need to make some changes.
So
I'm
here's my
sorry,
question.
I have to go.
Yeah, last question.
Okay.
What and last question, I want to be a non-political question. I want it to be kind of a question for the people, which is what stories do you think need to be told that haven't yet? And what opportunities as a storyteller do you see in this at this point?
I'm so glad you asked that. Well, I think one of the most important stories that has not been told is the story of sort of the long-standing tradition of a movement for civil rights and
Mm-hmm.
citizenship in Iran, which didn't begin in 2022 or 2017 or even in 1979. It began in the middle of the 19th century. I think it's very important, both for Iranians within the country and for the international community, to recognize that Iranians are not trying to adopt something that's not their own from the West, whether that's
Mm-hmm.
democracy or rule of law. They're trying to continue with a tradition that dates back to nearly 150 years ago. And this is a struggle that we are only seeing a new phase in it that has been going on for a very long time. In some ways, I think it's comparable to what the United States experienced in its own lifespan. You had here in the United States, we had 1776 that was supposed to bring about independence and equality for all, but it didn't. It brought equality for some, but not all. And it took decades until we came to the civil rights movement and the 1960s, when finally all the promises that had been made within the Bill of Rights, within the U.S. Constitution, became available to all Americans. I think the movement that Iran has begun from 150 years ago to now is a similar process. And I think the fact that this movement is unknown, both by the younger generations inside Iran
Mm-hmm.
and by the international community, is actually a roadblock to understanding that Iranians are not trying to be Europeans, that Iranians are just trying to be themselves, that they're trying to complete a process that they themselves began a long time ago. And this is not a betrayal of who they are as Muslims or who they are as Iranians, but this is the fulfillment of something, of a promise that excited the nation many decades ago, and we hope that process finally comes to fruition.
A great point to end on, because I hope many conversations will arise just from that need to happen. We need to be looking past the usual talking points and dig deeper into history, quite frankly. Thank you so much for this really meaningful conversation. Everyone watching this, please tune in next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. for our next program. And thank you so much to Roya Hakakian for joining us, and for everyone who stayed with us until the end. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Irina.